It's time to bust out the gouache. Gouache, if you don't know, is often called opaque watercolor because it is paint that you can activate and reactivate with water, but it also is opaque. So I love to use white gouache especially. You've already seen it in some of my other videos. I like to use white gouache especially in landscape paintings. So in this painting, the gouache is kind of going to be the star. We're painting a rocky waterfall, and I think it's going to be so much fun. Welcome to day 5 of my Painting the Wilderness challenge, my friend. I'm so excited to get started on this Rocky Falls scene. This one is probably the most challenging one yet, just because we're combining a lot of different elements that we've already practiced in multiple layers, and we are painting water. Water is really hard to paint, but with these pretty simple techniques and using gouache, I think you'll be very happy with the results. As a reminder, watch for the end of the video for a chance to win a copy of my book. So the first layer we did using the wet on wet technique was the sky, a very, very light, watery, light value blue. You can hardly even see it. I've let the sky dry, and now I'm going to paint the first mountain layer. So I'm doing a pretty light gray. As a reminder, in order to mix gray, I mix Payne's gray with a little bit of burnt umber, which is brown, and that usually gets me a pretty decent light gray. So this is the very background mountain layer, and I'm starting up in the top left-hand corner and doing some very jagged edges to make that first thick stroke, and then using water to bring it all the way down the page to avoid those dried paint lines. Then, while that mountain layer is still wet, I'm using a size 2 brush to paint just a few trees right along that ridge line. I'm not going to do the whole ridge line this time because we're trying to get an effect, where there are just a few trees kind of poking out of this mountain. So in a few places along the mountain, I'm going to paint some trees, but not everywhere. I'm just kind of going with the flow. I'm going to let that mountain layer dry, and this is where we're going to practice what's called glazing. Glazing is a technique that basically just means painting on top of an already dried layer. So because of watercolor's transparency, you can use so many layers of watercolor in order to create intricacy and complexity and different textures, and that is one of my favorite ways to create crags and rocks in mountain layers. And so I'm using a very, very light value burnt umber kind of gray color in order to create even more crags in that first mountain layer. I did kind of like a scumbling technique, meaning I didn't have any rhyme or reason. I was just kind of moving my hand around and making sure to leave behind some white space, and then I went ahead and let that dry. That background layer is not as much pressure because it's in the background, so it's really just there to add some depth. Now we're doing the next mountain layer, and so I did just a slightly darker value, and I kind of started up high and then dipped down below. And in this mountain layer, we are leaving behind white space for the waterfall. As you can see, I kind of left a chunk of white space in as I was painting this mountain layer, and that's because that's kind of where the waterfall is going to go. So I am letting that dry, and now I'm going to practice my not glazing this time. I'm going to paint some more trees while that mountain layer is still wet. I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So while that mountain layer is still wet, I'm taking just slightly darker value gray and adding some trees in the same way that we did on the other layer, but these trees are just a little bit darker because they're a little bit closer to us in the foreground. As a reminder, when you're trying to create depth, lighter means it's farther away, darker means it's closer up. So that's a very useful rule to remember when you're trying to create distance and depth in a painting like this with lots of different layers. So similar to the previous mountain layer, I'm not painting trees along the whole ridge line, just in a few places. so we can have some variation there. Now I have let that mountain layer dry, and I'm going to use glazing once again to create some kind of like craggy shadows along this mountain because, mountains are made of rock, right? And they have a lot of different textures and depths to them, and using this glazing technique along with it's kind of like a scumbling technique where I'm just painting randomly all around in crooked lines, lots of kind of different blobs. If you're looking at me painting and thinking she has to like have some kind of rhyme or reason, I don't. I think a general thing that I like to remember when I'm painting a glazed layer on a mountain is to think about really crooked, jagged angles. So I don't want to create curves. I want to kind of capture those lines, but I don't want the lines to be straight, and I don't want the lines to have much curve to them. So I'm doing glazing in multiple layers here. I started with a very light burnt umber, and then I'm adding some coloration where I created kind of an orangey mixture by adding carmine and yellow ochre to that burnt umber. And then I added even more yellow ochre to make it a lighter orange. And so those layers were just on top of that first glaze layer. And as you can see, it's very messy, and that is okay. We are practicing discomfort here and practicing allowing the mess to happen, which painting mountains is actually kind of a perfect subject for that because mountains are so craggy and messy. So we've let those glazed layers dry, and we're doing one final layer of deep shadows here. So I have an even darker gray, an even more pigmented gray, which I got by adding some more Payne's gray. And I'm doing not quite as much scumbling here because I want these to be more like accent shadows. These are just kind of, where the rock really juts inward, and you can see some pretty wide cracks in there. And so I'm having a little bit more intention when I'm painting these cracks. For example, this kind of like cave going inward that I'm painting, which started with that dark gray in that kind of triangle shape, and then I'm using water to bring down that wet paint in order to kind of make a gradient in that kind of triangle along the bottom there to make it seem like there is a wider, almost cave-like structure in that mountain. So, but again, I'm really just kind of trying to practice letting my hand do its thing. And even if I don't particularly like where all of the crags ended up, that's okay. I'm letting it be where it is and practicing living in that discomfort. So I let those mountain layers dry. And now the space where I want the waterfall to go, I'm first going to get wet with clean water. And then I'm taking some gouache, and I'm going to use the wet on wet technique as I just kind of paint the gouache along where I want that waterfall to be it's kind of off center, right? So it starts a little bit off center and then goes down to the bottom of the page. And using the water allows the wet on wet technique for the gouache to kind of bloom along outward. And then I'm also going to take a clean paintbrush. So I washed off my gouache, and I'm going to take a clean paintbrush and just kind of lightly blend the edges of that waterfall into the mountain. So it looks like the mist from the waterfall is kind of just misting along the mountainside. And the tricky thing about water is that, especially waterfalls, is you really don't see the water as much as you see the shadows. And so, with this mist, we're just trying to lightly paint the gouache over on top of the side of the mountain so it looks like this very ethereal, has this very ethereal effect. And the cool thing about gouache too, and using all of these layers, is it's okay if you have some harsh dried lines. We're not trying to worry about making sure there are no paint lines at all, because gouache kind of blends into the side. So once you've kind of gotten to a place that you're okay with, while the gouache is still wet, just paint a couple light strokes of Payne's Gray right into the gouache, and then use a clean brush to kind of blend those strokes of Payne's Gray into the water. Because once again, the thing about a waterfall especially is you're not really looking at the water, you're really looking at the shadows in the water, right? And so that's kind of what we're trying to capture with the middle of that waterfall. And finally, as a last touch of this waterfall, after it's dry, at this point that layer of water is dry, we're going to take some gouache using the wet on dry technique and just kind of do a little bit of scumbling, a little bit of random marks with your size 6 brush to add some texture, to add some even more depth to this water. So your waterfall, as you can see, is so messy. It is so messy, and that's what it's supposed to be. And so if you are looking at your waterfall thinking, ugh, this looks terrible, that's okay. It's supposed to be messy, and even if you don't like what you've made right now, there's still a lot to learn from here. And so, it's okay to be disappointed if what you've created isn't what you wanted, but you are still a wonderful artist, and you can take what you've learned and turn it into, even more magic in the future. So once that waterfall has dried, we're going to take some darker gray and we're going to paint a cliff right in front of that waterfall, and then a little bit lighter gray for a smaller rock jutting on the side. Let those dry, and then I'm taking a size 2 brush and creating outlines of some rocks. So we're going to paint kind of rocky shores along the waterfall here, and we're going to paint these rocks in layers. So meaning we're not going to paint each individual rock. Instead, we're going to look at the whole bed of rocks as individual layers. And so we're going to start doing that by painting the outlines of the rocks. And we're doing that on both sides of the mountain. So the right side of the mountain is very dark because it's cast in shadow, while the left side of the mountain, we started light because it's cast a little bit in more light, and we want to maintain some of those light layers, but the process is still relatively the same, where we've taken those big, larger chunks of mountain, and with a lot of little random outlines and kind of, craggy rocks and circles and whatever, we're trying to just form this rock bed with this general outline, and this is going to be the first layer. I also put just a few rocks in the actual stream in the river where the waterfall is, falling. And now we're going to, after that layer is dry, we're going to start adding even more layers onto these rocks, because rocks are made up of lots of different kinds of sediment, right? And so we're taking a little bit of, that orange mixture with the burnt umber and carmine and the yellow ochre, and just glazing on top of those outlines different colors. The biggest goal here is to make sure to leave behind the previous layers. So we're not trying to paint over everything. We want to create texture. And with these layers, that's what we're doing. We're leaving behind lots of white space so that these rocks have a lot of texture and contrast. And so the final layer of those rocks was just a little bit of that dark gray in a few places to have some shadow. Next, we're going to wet the river area and then add some more white gouache to make it look like these are kind of rapids flowing down from the waterfall and along the rocks. So once you have that white gouache there, then I'm going to add a tiny bit of gray once again to make it look like there's shadow in the water, so that we can kind of see where these waves are crashing. This is supposed to look random. This is supposed to look messy. So, don't be afraid to just kind of make a big old mess, because that's exactly what will help this river look really cool. And then I'm gonna take use the dry wet on dry technique to create some texture on top of that river. And finally, I'm going to add one final layer of contrast to that really dark cliff there by making it a little bit adding another layer of dark gray, and then adding some more shadows onto the rocks. As we've practiced before, one of the best ways to add depth and complexity to your piece is to slowly, one layer at a time, add darker and darker layers of contrast. And that's exactly what we're going for with this final layer. And then we're just going to add some, more interesting elements with some trees. I kind of started this tree on the top cliff thinking I knew what I wanted, and then it ended up really messy. And honestly, if I did something different, it would probably be to plan out that tree and the angles of the tree a little bit better because it looks really weird. But that's okay. And then I added some more just kind of dry brush glazing on the right side of that cliff to add more texture. I added a couple trees jutting into the scene on the other side. And then I'm finishing this scene with just a little bit of white gouache onto that cliff side to kind of, make it seem like the mist is almost curling over the cliff. So the final pieces of this piece were just kind of honestly random, haphazard. This piece feels really, really messy to me. It's one of those pieces where honestly I probably would have redone it. But we're in the era of being just in the air of being messy and embracing that imperfection, we're going with it. And so let's talk about what I loved about this piece and what I learned. I really, really loved actually the water and how I got the water to splash up against the cliffs. I thought that was cool. In the end, I actually really liked the messiness. I liked kind of the haphazard way that the glazed layers came together, and I definitely loved the contrast of the dark and the light layers. I think that I learned to put a little more patience in my layering. I think the shadows on my mountain were a little darker than I wanted, and I probably would have tried to do those trees at a little bit of a better angle, but that's okay. I really ended up loving this piece so much, and I hope that you did too. As a reminder, leave a comment if you want a chance to win a copy of my book. Any comment, I would love to hear what you have to say. I hope you enjoyed this project a lot, and I will see you next time.